Hello, everybody. Welcome back to episode three or part three of The Empire, where I'm discussing the 5 hours of this documentary by Jeremy Paxman called The Empire, the complexities of the British uh, Empire, basically, that ruled over most of the world. Now, I was thinking about how the Roman Empire um, ruled I think it was called the Mediterranean Sea, right? And how all of these, now we live in a global capitalist society, well, mainly for like the Western and kind of like second world countries. But I think that all started with Rome, right? And I think it really started with this idea of like, um, you're kind of like in an island, or you have to travel through sea, and that traveling through sea, like through ships, like literally moving people and things, is what kind of gets the commercial aspect of things going. Now, if you think about it, the British Isles, right? There are a bunch of islands, and well, if they want to interact with anybody else around the world, they have to know how to navigate. And like the United States now being the commercial superpower that it is, it's not an island, but it is an island. America is like a big island, right? Compared to the rest of the world. The rest of the world's kind of like together. Like, you have Asia, Europe, Africa, like the Middle East, India, even Australia. Like all of that is kind of like there. I mean, Australia is kind of an island, but it has like all those little islands to the north of it. But if you really think about it, like America is kind of an island. The United States is kind of an island too. Like it has those two like sections on the east and the west coasts, right? Where you could have like things coming in. And then it has like Canada to the north, Mexico to the south, Latin America to the south. But I think you need that type of like ideology. And I don't know if that comes with feeling like you have everything down, you know? I mean, what I mean by having everything down is that you have everything like in its place. You're living a good life, maybe so good that you may even feel bored, and you have this itch for adventure, right? So this third hour starts off by talking about the gentleman adventurer. They even call him a decent chap, right? Like what you wanted to be back when the British Empire was around was a decent chap. Like you were gonna go around and travel to all over to the colonies that the empire had under its control, like to India, Hong Kong, Jamaica, Canada, Africa, wherever you wanted to go, you could go. But you needed to be like a decent chap, right? You needed to have like a good education, not to overdo it, right? Obviously, this wasn't always the case, but this third hour focuses on sports, right? It starts out by talking about sports, how they brought, how the British Empire brought over games, and fair play, and how it wasn't really how, um, it wasn't really victory, but how you played the game that mattered, right? So they start by talking about Richard Burton and John Hannon speak in 1857, and how they were exploring the Nile River. And eventually, this gets them to what is now referred to as Lake Victoria, which is the source of the Nile. Now, I really enjoyed the fact that John Hannon here just kind of did this by intuition. Like he just set out one day exploring. And I think like a couple hours later, when he was by himself, he left Richard Burton back at the campsite, and he comes across the lake. And after Queen Victoria, like a lot of these like adventurers would just crown the place like after their Queen Victoria, so they call it Lake Victoria. And he wasn't sure if it was the source of the Nile, but he had this intuition, and he was right, because that is where the Nile starts, I guess, back in Africa. um, so yeah, I'm thinking the Englishmen were sea people. They were explorers, because maybe they had that like traditional sense back at home, and they were kind of tired of that. Many of them, I'm not saying all of them, I'm sure many of them probably stayed home and stayed in Britain, and they didn't want to go anywhere else. But many other ones were kind of like, they say they would explore for knowledge, for excitement, and later it was like for power, right? Um, So yeah, they talk about the decent chap, the rugby school, remove the child from home, right? And this makes reference to like you go to college to get an education, but they're also gonna like teach you about the world, right? Obviously, through sports and through Christian values, which they say sports was the rock on which Britain was born. They talk a lot about cricket, and this is kind of like a theory that I have. I was like, what if the more games you play, the more developed that country or that civilization is? Because if you really think about it, sports make reference to like just how much of a comfortable life you have. You have such a comfortable life. You have a lot of free time that you can dedicate to sports and energy. You know you have like your basic necessities met: shelter, food, clothing, right? Even like psychological needs, safety. You're okay to the point that you can actually spend your time like doing sports, right? So I think it does. I think even the Mayans would play sports. So I think that may be a characteristic of civilized societies, whether old or new. If you have a lot of sports, maybe that's because you are more developed than other cultures. I'm not sure. Let me know what you think in the comments. That's just a theory that I thought about. And they eventually go to Sudan, and they say this phrase, which is play up, play up, play the game. And I guess this is a poem written in 1884. This phrase basically means, in quite vulgar terms, to have balls. And it's represented by Charles George Gordon. I believe he was beheaded, and he basically became a hero in the siege of Khartoum. Now, the siege of Khartoum was basically where the Sudan people and the British people faced off, right? They also talk about this idea like if you have power, you feel that you are not equal, which I really liked in the documentary. I think I agree with that. They talk about people in power and how they are always talking about how everyone should be equal. Yet, if you have power, there's no way you feel equal, right? So even if you say that you are, what happened to Charles George Gordon made him like a mythological hero to the British people, because the Sudan people were being like oppressed by the British, and there was this war that broke out, the siege of Khartoum, and in it there's a famous picture, right, where Charles George Gordon is obviously being like surrounded by the Sudanese, more specifically the Mahdi's. I think it was the Mahdi's, and they end up killing him because he wouldn't quit. He wouldn't give up. I mean, he wasn't fighting anymore, but he was just there like as defying the Sudan people, right? So obviously Kitchener, this other guy, comes in, and Churchill was there also, and they execute their revenge on the Sudan people in 1897. They called it was basically the spears versus the machine guns, so they really stood no chance. And Kitchener eventually gets the Mahdi's. No, sorry, the Mahdi was the leader. He gets the Mahdi skull, right? And I guess he keeps it or something like that. They would also refer to Sudan as the machine of Sudan, because I guess like Sudan produced a lot of goods. Um, and then we have like the propaganda that the empire was basically divulging during this time, like with Chums and White's World, or Wider World, which were magazines where they depicted these type of heroes, right, like empire heroes, going over and basically like converting the people. Um, and yeah, I find that like interesting, because you do need a certain level of propaganda in order to make your cause appear more genuine and I guess like more benevolent, right? Um, then they go to Hong Kong. Hong Kong is very interesting. It talks about how in the 1840s it was a British colony, and a trading post for China. So they go there, and the British set up a horse track. It's called Happy Valley Race Course. And Jeremy Paxman says this phrase where he says that they say when the French take over a place or they colonize a place, the French build a restaurant, the Germans a road, and the British a racehorse, right? Which I thought was kind of funny. And then we jump over to Port Royal, Jamaica, which was under this is incredible. It was under British rule since 1655, and they established cricket there. Now, Jamaicans, this is kind of like where you see all of those cultural characteristics like kind of come together, and you think of Jamaicans, and you wouldn't imagine them playing cricket, but they do because they were ruled by the British, and the British took cricket with them, right? They took sports with them. So that was kind of interesting. The cricket thing is kind of a controversy, I guess, in Jamaica because it is a symbol of oppression. Yet many people play it. Like they were showing kids in the documentary playing cricket. Um, and eventually, like during the 1960s, like as I said, 1950s, 1960s, like the empire starts to lose its grip on all these colonies. There was a captain of cricket in Jamaica. I think his name was Frank Worrell, and in 1962 he becomes like the first. No, in 1962 Jamaica becomes the first Caribbean island to gain its independence. But this was after some of these like social changes, where Frank Worrell, a Jamaican, was I don't know allowed, or he just took the place of a captain. Where before during cricket or in cricket games, the British were the ones who had like the good spots and the good positions within the game. But then eventually, the Jamaican people also started to have like good roles and good positions in the game, right? Then they go into like this satirical part, like ripping yarns, I guess, in the 60s, where now they're even making fun of the British, right? The British are making fun of the British, and we can see this with like in the United States too, with the hippie movement, and how basically you start to lose faith in your governors, right? And then they talk about the Boy Scouts, which this is, I think, like one of the most interesting things, kind of like the Jerusalem ordeal with the Jewish and the with the Jews and the Arabs back with the English after World War One. This I found it to be also very interesting. The Boy Scouts was founded by a guy named Robert Baden Powell, along with other people, but he was the one of the main founders, and he was a British imperialist. So his idea of the Boy Scouts was actually for the British explorers to go out and have all of the strategies and knowledge they needed in order to explore, which is what they were doing. Like ultimately, that's what the British were doing when they were out and about exploring, all of these colonies. So, it makes sense that the British founded this. I think at the beginning it was called the Young Knights of the Empire or something like this. Yeah, so for me, this is kind of like the opposite of a tourist because, like I mentioned, I think the British or England is like tourists, So this is the opposite of relaxation, which is something that what tourists would do. Just kind of like relax, work hard, and relax, because this is like an appetite for adventure. So I think this is like the opposite of his culture, and we tend to see this. I think this idea came to me by watching What If Altist videos. Shout out to What If Altist, but he says, you have these cultures, and then their act of rebellion is usually what they lack, right? Like the United States, maybe it's kind of like this culture of like well, they say they're freedom, but it's like um, constraints, right? They call it like maybe the wise constraints that make men free, like from that video that I mentioned. And these type of constraints, these type of limitations, all this type of bureaucracy, allows for a rebellion like the hippie movements, right? Where it's like, where is the love, right? You see a lot of this with like a lot of the cultures right? So with the British, maybe it was like that was the act of rebellion, right? Like you can be at home, you're comfortable here in England. I mean, I know England wasn't the best place either to be like during these centuries, right? Like from the 1600s to like the early 20th century, especially during the early 20th century, which was at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, where there were a lot of poor people, Jack the Ripper, all these type of problems. But but it makes sense that the British, with their very traditional nature and culture, would basically, out of it would come out explorers, people that would seek adventure, right? Like rebellious to the traditions, right? Like I don't care about the traditions. Like let me go out and explore the world, right? Let me find that the diversity that I don't have back home. Yet they did miss home, like we saw with the bungalow houses and stuff like that. So yeah, I think it was that appetite for adventure. And just to finish this topic off, talking about the scout promise, because they were talking about the scout, like Jeremy Paxman goes up to some scouts and he starts talking to them, some Boy Scouts, they're kids, and he's like, what is the promise? Do you guys know the promise, the Boy Scout promise? And it got me thinking about the promise, and I asked ChatGPT, and it says that back in 1907, when the Boy Scouts was founded by Robert Powell, the Boy Scouts promise did mention the Queen, right? But obviously now it got kind of modified, and Boy Scouts is even worldwide. It's international and inclusive, and it makes sense coming from the British Empire, because the British Empire ended up in all these colonies. But like we already mentioned, the British Empire affected all these colonies, but all these colonies also affected the British Empire, right? So it was like a reciprocal thing. And I looked up on the internet, like what is the Boy Scouts promise? Now there's a bunch of them. There's like a squirrel promise. There's like a bunch of other promises, but obviously now it doesn't mention the Queen. It just mentions God and country. But yeah, kind of interesting to see that evolution of the Boy Scouts into now like a worldwide recognized institution, where in the beginning it started as the British Empire. And so did education. I think the education system we have nowadays is thanks to the British Empire. That's why it's an education system for people to work, right? Like it's not. That's why now there's like an education, like that revolution of we have to make students critical thinkers and all this stuff, right? Creativity, because the system is designed for to make bureaucratic, effective workers, right? Like I think one of the ideas around there was you needed to be able to have the same information and communicate with the same people. If it was like all the way to the north in England, to all the way to the south in South Africa, or all the way to the east in Australia, or all the way to the west in Canada, you needed to be able to have consensus on what the information was, right? And especially when they didn't have technology. I saw that in this TED talk. If you want to know, let me know, and I'll share the link in the comments. But yeah, education also came from there. So yeah, this was the third hour. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll be making the fourth and fifth hour in the upcoming videos. So I'll see you then. Peace.